ID, which
Good day, everyone. This is Jerry Green from Los Angeles, and I'm the only one in Los Angeles. Neither of our guests are, so I need to make that point. I want to welcome you to our event on Ukraine Redux. And before I introduce our speakers, I just want to tell all of our members that this Friday we will be having an event in person with all of the usual precautions being taken outdoors, and we're having Mariano Florentino Cuellar speak, who is interestingly a former justice for the California Supreme Court, who's the CEO and president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His predecessor is Bill Burns, who runs CIA. And Tino, as he is called, will be talking about global California, which is a topic near and dear to our heart. So just let us know, go to our website, you can register. We hope to see you Friday. I want to welcome back Dr. Anya Grigas and Ambassador John Emerson. We were just talking, we did this 3 weeks ago, and who would have thought that we would be back discussing the unfortunate, tragic events that came to pass after our two experts expressed fervent hope that it wouldn't happen, but we're not certain that it would not. So I'd love to see them both, but I wish we weren't back here, and I wish we were talking about something else. I mean, this is a sad time for humanity. Let me briefly reintroduce both of our guests. The first, and they're Pacific Council members, obviously, Dr. Anya Grigas, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She is a leading expert on Russia, on Eastern Europe, specifically energy issues, which is playing a key geopolitical role in the unfolding crisis/tragedy. She spends her time equally dealing with government officials, the think tank community, and the business community. She's the author of 3 acclaimed books, including The New Geopolitics of Natural Gas, which was published by, I'm from Boston, so I can call it Harvard University Press. She's got another book about Beyond Crimea with Yale University Press, very timely given what's going on, and it was selected as one of Newsweek's top 10 books on Russia. I also want to introduce Dr. John Emerson, Dr. Ambassador. He's a lawyer, so lawyers are technically, they get a juris something doctoris, but in this case, Ambassador John Emerson, who's the former US ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany, vice chairman of the Capital Group International, emphasis on the word international, and is a member of the board of directors of the Pacific Council on International Policy. Ambassador Emerson was confirmed by the United States Senate, which in these days is not something to take lightly, on August 1st, 2013, as our ambassador to Germany. During his time in Germany, he was the 2015 recipient of the State Department's Sue M. Cobb Award for exemplary diplomatic service. And John was not only a great ambassador in terms of geopolitics and US foreign policy, but he also ran a really, really good embassy. And people forget that managing a large, important embassy is an important part of the responsibility. His work has been acknowledged by the United States Navy, by the Central Intelligence Agency. He has left government but continues to serve. He's chair of the American Council on Germany. He's on the board of the German Marshall Fund and the American Friends of the Munich Security Conference. And John actually was in Munich at the security conference when Zelensky was there and Tony Blinken was there and Kamala Harris and others. John, in fact, is joining us from Europe after attending the Munich Security Conference, and Anya is at as I say, outside the country at a business conference, which must be quite a place to be. Let me start by asking each of our guests to say a few words of what's on their mind. I'll ask a couple of questions, and then to our audience, please funnel me questions, and I will ask them on your behalf. Anya, let's begin with you. What is on your mind? What should we be thinking about? And welcome back, of course.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here, but I wish we were having a different discussion today than we are indeed. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I'd like to highlight maybe 5 brief points right now, and then we can come back to that during our discussion. So the first, I think what we've really seen in the last week is that Putin invaded Ukraine on the basis of a number of miscalculations. He miscalculated that Ukraine is not going to fight back. He miscalculated that the Ukrainian government is going to fall. And he miscalculated that the West is not going to do anything about it. So now when I think he's found himself in this situation that I think he really didn't expect the full extent of it, the big question for me is, how far is he willing to push this? I'm afraid that he'll be afraid to lose face. I'm afraid that he'll want to exact some sort of victory to justify this incursion. So my second point is, we're talking a lot about Ukraine, but I would like us to also keep an eye on Belarus. What's going to happen with Belarus after all of this? Belarus was used as Putin's troops moved from Belarus, and now Belarusian troops are likely to move together with Russian troops as well into Ukraine. Will these Russian troops ever leave Belarus is a big question for me, and what will remain with, what will be the outcome for that country and the Lukashenko regime. So I think that's the second, implication. The third really is the international community, and we've seen such a turnaround just in the last few days. I'd love to hear from Ambassador Emerson more on what his views are, particularly in Germany's complete, I would say, epiphany, as the Wall Street Journal used that term as well, where they went from kind of having this Ostpolitik and trying to have friendly diplomatic relations with Germany to really now seeing that they have to take a stand, they have to give weapons to Ukraine, they have to think about their energy security seriously, not just hope for importing Russian gas. I think the fourth implication for me is that as all of these events unfold, I'm sure China is watching carefully and taking notes, seeing how far another authoritarian regime can get away with in this type of challenging international law and an invasion. And the fifth point is definitely about the energy sector. One of the primary means that Russia is able to fund this military campaign and its regime is through oil and gas sales, and primarily to Europe. So it'll be interesting to see to what extent Europe can make the necessary changes. They're still, of course, very dependent on Russian energy sources, but what changes will they make? And to what extent, honestly, the US can fill that gap? To what extent American energy companies can meet the need of its European allies. So these are kind of the 5 things that I'm thinking about right now, and I'm happy to come to any of these during our discussion.
John, over to you. Thank you, Anya.
Okay, thanks, Jerry, and thanks again for having me and all my colleagues at Pacific Council. It's great to be with you. And Anya, I agree with everything you said. I think you hit the kind of 5 key points. Let me, without necessarily reiterating them, because I think we'll get into a discussion, just make a couple of other observations. Number one, and this certainly isn't in the order of importance, but I am kind of struck by how our intelligence community actually got it right every step of the way. They got it wrong in Afghanistan for sure. They did not predict the fall of Kabul happening when it did. The President of the United States was allowed to go out and talk about, this isn't going to be like Saigon. We're not going to see helicopters pulling people off buildings, literally 2 weeks before we saw people falling off of airplanes because they were trying to hang on to them. But the intelligence community really did get it right every step of the way. The reason I'm making that point is in Munich, when there was all this talk about what Putin was about to do at least from the IC, I heard a lot of snarky comments about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So I think this is actually something that'll have a longer term positive consequential effect in terms of our relationship with our allies. Second point, we need to take these guys at their word, whether it's Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or any of these other autocrats. If you kind of step back, Putin has simply been progressing down this road for well over a decade. I mean, he has clearly said on multiple occasions, the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the dissolution of the USSR. Not two world wars, not the Holocaust, not 40 million people killed either in World War II, Russians killed either in World War II or by Stalin. Not any number of the the horrible tragedies, nuclear weapons being used, et cetera, that we've seen. But the breakup of the USSR, the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. And he's made very clear his sort of, philosophical or, ultimately his approach to do everything he can to try to build that back. He's also made clear that by his action, he is absolutely intolerant of color revolutions on his border. By that, I mean like a orange revolution, or if you think about the yellow revolution in the Philippines, but people's revolutions. I mean, it was the folks protesting on the Maidan, the fact that Yanukovych changed his mind and was no longer going to be moving Ukraine in the direction of the EU. Folks came up in the Maidan, protested that resulted in not only Yanukovych fleeing, but also then Putin coming in, grabbing the Crimea, starting the war in the Donbass. And let's remember, this is a war that's been going on since 2014. It's accelerated dramatically now, but it has been going on since 2014. He wrote a couple 1,000-word tome about how Ukraine is really part of Russia. The Ukrainian people and Russian people share so much, and that Russia just created Ukraine out of whole cloth. It's not really a country. It's just a part of Russia. And of course, you don't even have to just pay attention to what he says. Look at what he does. If you think about, well, at least what his predecessor, I guess, did in Georgia, what he did in Chechnya, what he did with the Donbass, what he did with Crimea. The fact that we're at this point should not be surprising. And I would say my takeaway from that is we better pay close attention to what Xi Jinping says he wants as well, because these guys aren't coming out of left field, at least in terms of how they're building their approach to their geopolitical approach. And that also, I guess the third point, that also begs the question of, have we been responding effectively to the various actions that have been taken by Vladimir Putin over the years? Whether it's poisoning political leaders or cyber attacks or obviously, Donbass, Crimea, et cetera. And I get the sense that, the metaphor about boiling the frog. If you have boiling water, a pot of boiling water, you throw a frog in, he jumps right out. But if you put the frog in a pot of warm water and you turn up the heat a little, it kind of sticks around, turn up the heat a little more, it kind of sticks around. And before you know it, the frog's being boiled. I feel like Putin's been boiling the frog when it comes to the West in terms of how we've responded. And I do think that as we move past this, and God hope we will at some point, that we need to rethink sort of the approach that we've been taking. And I guess the final point, and we can get to Germany later, but the final point is, and just to reiterate what Anya said about Putin's miscalculation, I mean, the resounding message coming out of the Munich Security Conference was how extraordinarily together the alliance is, whether it's the NATO alliance or the EU, or of course the transatlantic alliance, notwithstanding the fact that we had some missteps. We had the 4 years of Trump, America First. You had anger in Europe over the sub-snub, the AUKUS alliance that Europe was sort of left out of, and of course there was some anger about the way the whole Afghanistan pullout was handled. And there just no comments or focus on that at all. Total unification. I heard from Stoltenmeier, the head of NATO, said at the Munich Security Conference, NATO nations have never been so united since the end of 9/11, or since the advent of 9/11. So this is, I think, a very, very positive. And what I was worried about, and I think we got into this in our last conversation, is if Putin were truly shrewd, he wouldn't go with a full-scale invasion where it was clear you had sort of a united approach to the sanctions, but he would go with, something short of that. So you've got Germany, who's very dependent upon, Russian gas, for instance, and Italy also very dependent on Russian gas. Are they going to really go along with throwing them off of SWIFT if, there's a minor incursion into the Donbass to capture more territory? If there's cyber attacks, attacks can be more than just sending troops across borders, those kinds of things. But he didn't do that. He did the full-scale invasion. And what's fascinating to me is not just that unity we felt at Munich continued, but that they've been putting the accelerator down. I mean, it's been 2 decades that we and other NATO nations, but particularly the United States, we've been banging on Germany to spend more on defense spending and to get up over that 2% threshold and not to build Nord Stream 2. Well, Vladimir Putin was able to turn that around in 72 hours. And then how about Switzerland, jumping on board? And how about, the president of the Czech Republic, who's been, fairly understanding of and pro-Putin, saying this changes things dramatically. So it's not even the traditional allies that you would have expected that are hanging together. It's really very much the entire world, which of course begs the question about China. And the only comment I'd make on that is I find it, and for sure, you're absolutely right, Anya, Xi Jinping is going to school on this. And I think he's getting a pretty, clear-eyed lesson about how the West will in fact respond to this kind of activity, think Taiwan. But he, I found it really interesting that when the motion to condemn Russia and its invasion of Ukraine came up in the UN Security Council, which of course Russia vetoed as a permanent member, it has that right. China didn't join with Russia. China abstained. And they didn't vote to condemn, but they abstained. I thought that was actually significant. And you wonder if from Xi Jinping's standpoint, this is becoming more of an annoyance than something that he would like to see happen, particularly since this annoyance has resulted in the West coming closer together when China's geostrategic objectives have clearly been to try to divide and conquer European countries from one another, and of course, Europe from the United States. So interesting things.
The flip side, however, is the heat is off Xi Jinping a little bit because Europe is back. And what this suggests to him is the West might be able to unify far more quickly, but we can't not fight fronts. This is going to sound sort of a double negative, not fight wars on multiple fronts. In other words, we're not engaged militarily in the Ukraine, but we're deeply engaged, with the Ukraine and Russia. So if I were Xi Jinping, I'd be a really happy guy. He's not waiting for, the head of state of a country with an economy less than Texas to save him. But this is an incredibly valued distraction for him because it'll make him, sort of do some of the things he wants to. This is the conversation we're going to have, next time we get together, which is, Europe is back. What does it mean? When is the United States going to get back in the grand strategy business? And I'm going to resist the temptation because it's so interesting, but much more narrowly. I see you, Anya, for you're a young person. So I was going to say decades, for years, laboring in an area of the world which everybody kind of dismissed. And this reminds me of my own career as an Iran specialist. People didn't pay a lot of attention, and then they realized how foolish they were to ignore it. Mitt Romney emerges as the sage of our time, that he called it, and he called it accurately. So Anya, what's the end game? It's hard to try and figure Putin out, for a whole variety of reasons, but he obviously can't occupy Ukraine in its totality. Will he try and install a puppet government? Will he try and create, enclaves and leave troops behind so to divide the country? Well, it's just, I can't even begin to make sense of it. So what's your thoughts on what's going on in his head?
The tactic that Putin used previously, and you can say the Russian government used previously as well, was creating these separatist zones, these enclaves. And that was done in Moldova, and it remains, I mean, since the 90s, there's a Russian, kind of military base, separatist territory in Transnistria. They did that in Georgia with South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And with Ukraine, I mean, well, it was a little different because they outright annexed Crimea. But then I assume that Luhansk and Donetsk is going to follow a similar model. That model was always beneficial to Putin because it was relatively low cost, but it created immense costs for the country in question. So, once countries like Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine, they don't have their full territorial integrity, that prevents them pursuing integration with the West, NATO, EU membership, so on. It keeps continuous pressure on the governments. And then Russia can always feel like, okay, we're going to wait it out, and we're going to see when a more pro-friendly Russian government is going to come into place into these countries. Well, I think with this invasion, I don't know, it's a result of miscalculation. I think part of the miscalculations was, frankly, the fact that the US and the West had done so little in response to their previous incursions. So I think it was potentially, they thought, an opportune moment, and maybe they could get away with it. I think they did expect that the Ukrainian government will fall under the pressure of the invasion, and then they could install a pro-Russian type of government that would essentially sign neutrality and say that Ukraine will never join NATO or any sort of Western organization like the EU, and probably join a Russia-led type of economic organization. So I think that's the end goal. By this point, though, I also see a leader like Vladimir Putin who has, frankly, not a lot to lose. This is a man already that has absolute power. He is a man towards, you can say, the second half of his life. He has extraordinary personal wealth. I mean, some calculate that he's actually the wealthiest person in the world. And he is probably, I would say at this point in time, looking at his kind of legacy in that sense of reestablishing, Russia's greatness. Russia is a great power, reestablishing its influence in the post-Soviet space. So I think his calculations, at least right now, appear for me to be beyond the realm of immediate cost-benefit analysis for the Russian state and for the Russian people, but more his own, again, historical legacy, his ideology, and things of that nature.
How are the Russian people, on the American news coverage, we see these demonstrations and people being arrested. There's always something somewhat self-serving about a lot of this
Yes.
TV journalism. Navalny is a very attractive, heroic figure to people like us. But what's your sense, I don't know who Joe Sixpack is in Russia, but, the average person in the street, how are they looking at this? I mean, this is a frail country, with a terrible economy.
On the one hand, we've seen protests across Russia against the war. I will also say that to go out and protest today in Russia, you have to be willing to be arrested, and you have to be willing to be beat up, maybe even brutally, by the police. So you have to have some conviction to go out in the streets. You're not going to do this lightly. So the people who do, I think there are a lot more people behind them who feel in a similar way. But then I have an alternative. For example, the Levada Institute, they do polls, and they've consistently been a very trusted source of polling and public opinion in Russia. I don't know under what pressure they are today, perhaps, but the polls they've released is basically that 70% of the Russian population support Russia's, invasion of Ukraine, or probably worded differently, helping our brothers in Ukraine, right? Or something like this.
Liberation. Right.
Liberation of Ukraine. So I think Joe Sixpack is watching and consuming Russian media. He doesn't have access to Western media. Already Russia has closed down Twitter access and other foreign media access. So, and that's the narrative that's presented. And again, when you mentioned, Ambassador Emerson, this famous quote from Vladimir Putin that, the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, most of the Russian public would agree with that statement as well. So this is not a Putin sentiment. This is a sentiment of the broad, general Russian public.
Yeah,
John, what?
I think that's absolutely right. You know, if you think about the Russian people, and their incredible capacity for enduring suffering, they suffered a lot during that period of time of the USSR, and they were told they had the best system in the world. And then the whole thing comes crumbling down like a house of cards. You could say, I mean, Putin's popularity went up over 90% in the initial Ukraine war. Sense of, hey, we're back. A couple of questions or just follow up commentary on this in terms of the protests, and the 70% number doesn't surprise me because that's clearly all they're getting and consuming is Russian news. But Putin's right. There are deep cultural and personal and familial connections between many Russians and many Ukrainians. And if they're using, which was as reported today, cluster munitions on civilian populations, you're going to start hearing, maybe shut down Twitter, this and that. People can still communicate. And they're going to start hearing, people are going to start hearing about friends and family members and others who are being brutally killed. That can have an impact. Heard a report yesterday from somebody in the military that 4,000 Russian soldiers have already been killed or wounded in this endeavor. And to put a context on that, in 20 years of the Afghan war, we lost 2,500 servicemen and women. Okay, in 20 years. This is in 96 hours that they've lost 4,000. And correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my understanding is one of the pressure points that came about in terms of ending the Chechen war was the mothers of Russia. And these protests of mothers are saying, where are my son? Where are sons? What's happening to them? Because they weren't even bringing the body bags back into the country. They were burying people, in Chechnya where they fell, basically. And I just wonder if today I get 70% rally around the flag, all that, but I wonder if this thing drags on, for several months, as it conceivably could. If you're going to see a change, how long that'll hold up. And then the second thing is, I'm curious about your point about absolute power, and I wonder if, with all the oligarchs now really being seriously sanctioned, with what clearly the impact is likely to be on the Russian economy, with a number of, I think it was an FZ, Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung, that a number of former generals of the Russian military wrote an op-ed piece basically saying they thought this was a bad idea. Presumably they're not living in Russia anymore, or they'd be joining Navalny, I guess. But, you wonder if at some point do the powers that be around in Russia, at some point, do they begin to question whether Putin's got it? And, you look at him on TV, it looks like the guy's been injecting cortisone in his face or something. I mean, he looks puffy. He's increasingly, seems wild-eyed. And I'm not saying he's, losing it, but I mean, he's made this such a personal, intense thing. You wonder if in time, and if I have my history right, it was only about 8 to 10 months after the Cuban Missile Crisis that Nikita Khrushchev was gone. And obviously it's a very different system and all that. But I'm just curious, both of you, actually, your thoughts on, could Putin have overstepped in a way that will that could jeopardize his hold on power, either from a genuine populist revolt of, it's kind of hard to call mothers of Russia outside agitators, and or the powers that be coming in and saying, okay, Vladimir, enough is enough.
Anya, what do you think? Because this is your part of the world.
Absolutely, I agree with this. I think Putin will have backing if he's winning, right? If this operation, people will rally behind the flag if things are working out. And I think that's why I think he's really pushed it a little bit too far. I mean, I think these are great miscalculations and things have not turned out the way he expected. So I do think there will be more pushback. And also with the Mothers of Russia, this was also a big movement during the Afghan war. And that was really when perestroika started, happening in the Soviet Union. what the Ukrainians have done, which is I find very interesting and great move, they've created a hotline where Russian parents can call in and they can find out in Ukraine whether their son has been killed, taken
Wow.
prisoner, and they can agree with the Ukrainian authorities to get their son's body back. Because again, this is the case in the past that Russia would not deliver their soldiers often back and would hide casualties, and families would not know sometimes for years or decades even what happened to their children. So I think this is a wonderful campaign that the Ukrainian government came up with, and that apparently already people have been calling in, or the last I checked, this was days ago, that several hundred people had already called in to inquire regarding their children. So when it comes to the elites as well, I think this could really be the end of Vladimir Putin's regimes. I mean, I really think he's put himself on the line, both from the internal stakeholders, the political elite and the oligarchs, and in terms of the public. But that's why, but it worries me. This doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't make me feel better, because I think he knows what is at stake. And
Right.
again, I feel like, how far will he take it? Again, he can't lose face. He can't lose. He has to extract some sort of win to justify this right now. And I don't know what kind of win he can possibly extract. I don't see it. I mean, he can bomb the entire country of Ukraine. He can overrun it with tanks. But again, I don't see this as a win, because remember, the Ukrainians have also, I mean, they fought in the resistance. They fought the Soviet occupation for 10 years. Okay, this was, they fought they've been, in 1990, the Ukrainian people voted for independence, 90% of them. In 91, they voted for independence. 70% of the population participated. Since the 2000s, they've had the Orange Revolution, they had the Maidan. I think they're pretty determined as well. So it's not going to be an easy win, even if you bomb the entire country.
And it's interesting. I mean, the Afghan leadership couldn't get out of Dodge fast enough with bags of loot to Dubai. Zelensky is there, and this
Zelensky is Winston Churchill.
That's exactly right, and he's a rather diminutive. He was on TV with these two gigantic guys standing next. He's not a big guy, and you're both exactly right. So you have Putin, this kind of wacky guy with that long table and these huge distances, and looking, and then you have Zelensky wearing camouflage stuff and looking like a real leader. And so it's I'm with both of you. It's hard to figure out how it can end, and everybody is dismissing the nuclear alert information. When people that have nukes talk about nukes, it always gets my attention. And I understand people shouldn't be panicked. But having said that, the notion of somebody like Putin having, access to nuclear weapons, it sort of distracts me from my obsession with Pakistan having nukes, a failed state with a nuclear capability. Now a failed leader with a nuclear capability. So I'm assuming, John, behind the scenes, people are taking this more seriously than they're telling us, right? I mean, give us, that was your world when you were, an ambassador. I sure hope so.
I think they're definitely, believe me, they are wargaming this every which way, right? Mm-hmm. There's no question about that. What if he chases troops into Poland, so on and so forth? If he does any of those things, Poland, the Baltics, he's basically starting World War III. Because then Article 5, the US is there, UK is there, France is there, Germany is there. He's basically starting World War III. So that's a bridge that's pretty far. In terms of nukes, it's just not clear to me. What are you gonna, it's probably tactical nukes would be what he'd be talking about. What are you gonna do? Nuke Kyiv? Great, then you got to deal with the consequences of that. And I think that most analysts see that more of Putin saying, hey, don't mess with us. Remember, we're a nuclear power. And one of the potential, he's been complaining, one of his grievances is, NATO nukes based in Europe. And maybe one of his, that this could be a way to start a conversation that could be part of a diplomatic off-ramp about a renewed, nuclear arms agreement as it relates to nukes in Europe. I mean, I don't know, but I can guarantee you the military and all is wargaming this, as if it's very serious. But everything coming out from the Biden administration was let's tone down the rhetoric a little bit. Let's not go there. So they haven't taken the debate. We haven't gone to DEFCON whatever, right? and so I think that's pretty much where it sits at this point.
Anya, we have
sorry, I'll just on
No,
that
go ahead.
the timing of when he made those statements about the nukes, because it was literally, I think, the day when Ukraine had, pushed back the Russian forces from Kiev. It was the day when they pushed back from Kharkiv. And I think he didn't want the news to dominate, with, Ukrainian victories. And instead, the news headline for those days were, Putin talks nukes.
Oh,
But
that's
I mean,
interesting.
yeah, but I mean, of course, it's still Russia is a nuclear power, and it is a great concern. It's a very grave concern. But I felt like his announcement was a little bit tactical.
Yeah, no, I had the same feeling. It's you when you sort of have people, who are potentially unhinged. And there are a lot of articles in the press about the psychopathology of Vladimir Putin, which, the fact that nobody knows anything or agrees is even more worrisome, and having a nuclear capability. But John, I want to ask you, since you're in Europe and you've been to more than one country, there's a sort of Europeanness that's coming out of this. I always felt there was a sort of artificiality about the Europe experiment simply because it takes time, it's generational and so forth. There are important, I think, Europeanness lessons being forged and identities being created. When the Foreign Secretary of the UK said, oh, if British citizens want to go fight for Ukraine, fine with us. And all of these countries are not encouraging their citizens to go, but permitting them to go. There's something different here. Zelensky submits his application online to join the EU. It's not like, getting into college, you just fill in the form, but there's something different there. And I'm not a Europe person the way you are, John. Does it feel different? Is there a sense of solidarity? Or
absolutely. I mean, when I first came over here for to post in 2013, there were just, I could have filled my office with printouts of articles, whither NATO, whither Europe. And then, of course, as we moved into Brexit, and then on top of that, the pressure, coming from the Trump administration and America First and the alliance breaking up and so on and so forth, that there's been just a lot of concern and skepticism and finger pointing and so on and so forth. And honestly, it's remarkable how this has just so quickly pulled people together and given Europe an identity, as you say, that maybe wasn't so clear before. Now, obviously, once this is all over, I'm sure you end up with some of the same criticisms, but they're all talking about the same things. They're all talking about building up defense capabilities. This is serious now. It's not theoretical. They're all talking about energy independence and the need to accelerate. There was all this grumbling in Europe about, or in Germany at least, about Merkel's Energiewende and moving away from nuclear and all that, and nuclear and coal actually, and now it's just we've got to get more independent. We have to invest in more renewables. We've got to figure out how we're going to get our gas, or transitional fuels, as I guess they call them, from other sources. Germany's bemoaning the fact they were supposed to be building these LNG regasification plants in Wilhelmshaven in the borders of the North Sea, and they that haven't completed that yet. So there's a renewed interest in getting that done, and on and on. it's just fascinating to watch that. And I think I mean, I think you've hit on something, Jerry. I mean, I think that's going to be a sea change. Not to say it can't be shaken, in the future, but it's a very different feel, a very different conversation. A lot of talk at Munich about, well, if push comes to shove, how much will the alliance really hold together if Putin starts cutting off the gas, or if he starts, with the cyber attacks, or if he, we can't seriously be talking about, throwing some of the banks out of SWIFT and all that. And now it's just, no, all right, good for you, let's go, is sort of the sense I get, just anecdotally, in talking to folks around here. So I do feel this has been, it's a European moment. And, the phrase that you constantly hear is for the first time in 70 years, an invasion and a war on European soil. And, is this, and people here, they maybe weren't alive when it happened, not too many of them, but they sure, culturally and every other way have pretty strong memories of 1939 and what that led to. So, so there's this sort of visceral reaction to this that I found fascinating.
And tragic that it took an event of this horror to galvanize something that they've been trying to, to promote for decades. Anya, there's a question here from Chip Pitts. I'm kind of cheating, and I see the questions as well. And what Chip is asking is, how is this going to change the geopolitics of natural gas? I mean, you've written books about this, so you're really the perfect person to ask the question to. And then he asks about, the withdrawal of BP and Shell and others. So what's the geopolitical, energy universe going to look like after this is over?
So I think it's going to depend on how far Europe will be willing to take this. Again, Europe is very dependent, at least right now, on Russian sources of gas, but there are alternatives. With LNG import terminals, they could rely on, American gas, American LNG, gas from the international LNG markets. Now, the extent to which, again, I think a lot of this will depend on Germany as well. It's interesting that up until, again, just you can say hours, however many hours it's been, that the question really came up whether Nord Stream 2 will be certified. And now the view is that no. And there's even questions now about Nord Stream 1, the pipeline that's already been in operation for almost a decade, whether that will be sanctioned. Of course, the future look in Europe is on renewables and green energy, but gas has been the transition fuel. So now the big question is whether Europe will be willing to continue buying Russian sources of energy. And actually, if we look at, there's been good data, I think it was in The Economist, but you'll see, if we look at how the Russian defense budget, annual defense budget, it's almost the equivalent of what the European countries pay Russia yearly in terms of, for gas and oil. So that's kind of the first way Europe can start making a dent in Russia's military expenditures by cutting that consumption of Russian oil and gas. Looking further, again, I think for me, it's very interesting to see where the US will come into play with this. Now there's been announcements that, American energy companies should, get their rig count up and be ready to export more energy into the global markets and particularly into Europe. But again, the United States is poised to be a leader in renewables. So hopefully with the American innovation and technology, together with Europe, they can make that transition happen sooner rather than later.
John, what do you think? I mean, I'm sure when you were in Berlin, you dealt with, all of these, these issues with some regularity, and Germany's position's always been, distinctive, but things have changed.
Well, Germany, one thing about Germany is it does not like leading alone. Or, it's sort of like that didn't work out for them too well in the 20th century. And there's, so Germany likes being part of NATO, part of the EU, part of, even the Normandy format of negotiations, or the JCPOA in terms of the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, Germany loves being an active part of these multilateral organizations, but I think that they've been schizophrenic about it, because they say it and then they don't equip their military the way you would think a NATO member should. Although I will say that when NATO created the four-nation framework nation concept for the three Baltics and Poland, that Germany is the only European nation that actually stepped up and took responsibility for one of the nations. The UK has, I think the US has Poland, the UK has Estonia, and I think is it Canada who has Lithuania, Anya, and then Germany has Latvia. But that requires moving, material and equipment so that you don't, the minute little green men show up in those places, you could be there, within 24 hours with, strong military presence to repel them. So they have stepped up to that. But the fact is they didn't step up as much as they should have. They haven't really stepped up economically. They did somewhat during COVID, but it's always, Germany's been the country advocating austerity, and you have the focus on their own balanced budget, which again, we'll see if that changes with this new government, but not helping the southern tier nations of Europe, and there's been political tensions there. So they've been trying to have it both ways, but I think Germany does not want to be the leader of Europe. Germany wants to be a strong and consequential nation within the context of a strong EU. I think it'd be where and that's regardless of party. I mean, I think that's whether it's the Social Democrats or the Greens or the Christian Democrats or even the Liberals, that's pretty much where they would be headed.
There's another historical first here with when it comes to defense. I mean, the European Union, for the first time in its history, designated funds for essentially for Ukraine to buy weapons. I mean, this has never been done before. I mean, having any sort of even common, defense, well, even having any sort of common defense policy was, again, this is a novelty for the European Union. So I think we're seeing rapid evolution. And I think even in just the last week, we've seen incredible change. And I think we can see how this situation in Europe will evolve. And I think we will also see an evolution of European foreign policy and defense policy. I think another interesting fact just for me to watch was how immediately the Central and Eastern European countries within the EU have basically given their weapons to Ukraine. And so the javelins that they had, the Stingers, the whatever weapons that they had, or the airplanes, the MiGs. So they were all willing to give those weapons to Ukraine immediately. And I think that's another type of, it reflects a changed thinking that we're all in this together. And this is actually the defense line, or the war that Ukraine is fighting today is actually our war, and it's kind of our defense line. So it's natural that we would send our weapons there.
And does Russia, other than its vassal states, sort of pseudo states, which are dominated by Russia, are they completely isolated globally? Does any countries actively support Russia, either, tangibly or even, sort of with some hope that the Russians will prevail here, or are they heavily isolated?
Well, I mean, there's the question of Belarus and Lukashenko's government, who I believe Lukashenko hopes that his participation in this and him sending Belarusian troops into Ukraine will ensure his longevity as a leader, because he's in a very, fragile position. The Belarusian public has been against him now for the past 10 years, trying to, overturn him. So, I mean, I think he's the only kind of ally who's willing to actually step up for this. Kazakhstan already said they're not going to send their troops.
Which is pretty amazing, actually, given the Russian
the
troops
Russians were just
prop
in
him up.
Kazakh. That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. So, no,
I
that's
was
interesting.
also, sorry to, but I was
Okay.
also interested to see that Turkey and Erdogan has kind of turned around. I mean, it seemed to be they were great buddies with Putin, and now he also closed the Bosphorus Straits to Russian military ships. And even Orban in Hungary, again, another close buddy of Vladimir Putin, even he said that, you know, they're going to support SWIFT and all of that. So
Yeah, no, we are looking, and again, we will certainly do this again at a vastly different geopolitical tableau. And what being a Middle East specialist, I can say this. You know, I've been to EU meetings in Brussels, and as an observer, and it makes watching paint dry seem absolutely riveting. Things just for me move so. You know, when you have to translate stuff into 26 languages or whatever, you know, it doesn't suit my pace. And the Europeans, I must say, they're laying the track as the train is going. And it's if it wasn't for such a tragic purpose, it would be really almost inspirational.
Well, you know, you think about it. I mean, this thing about memories of 39, but it's also memories. You know, the Czech Republic, 68, the Hungary, was it at 56 in Hungary? I mean, you know, I mean, you're right. You go, wow, on Orban, but if Orban's got any sense of history in terms of his country, you know, I got to believe that there's a lot of, you know, what do you call it? PTSD, I guess, that gets triggered among Hungarians when they think about Russia sending tanks into a,
John, you're freezing. Literally, I know John somewhere, and there you are. Go ahead, John. You froze, so we missed the last. Sorry.
I was just saying that's something that sense of you know, recollection of these kinds of invasions is something that I think is widely shared within Europe, and one reason why you might see such a quick coming together on this. Don't want to go there again.
One final question, and then we're gonna wind up, and then I will tell all of our audience the questions I've chosen not to ask, because I really want to understand what's going on the ground, and there's nobody better than our two guests to tell us. But John Francis is asking us, and this is a really important question: is it likely that American troops are going to be moved out of Germany farther east, and you know, closer to the border of NATO countries? And it's a really important question. So let me ask both of you.
Well, I first of all watched the State of the Union address tonight. I would be surprised if there isn't some mention in that about additional American troops to not just to Germany, but into Poland, for instance, which of course borders on Ukraine. I would be very surprised if you don't see something like that. One thing I think we can be certain of is there will not be American troops sent into Ukraine. I mean, they do not want to create that. And Biden's been very, very clear on it. Jen Psaki the other day was very clear on that. But for sure, particularly as part of the framework nation concept, we will see more troops into Germany and more troops. Kind of ironic, by the way, that the Trump administration was talking about pulling our troops out of Germany, incidentally, which made not a whole lot of sense, since they're mainly in our interest not to protect Germany. But I think you will see that, Jerry.
Anya, I would imagine.
I agree. And I would say also the Baltic states. I think we can expect American troops in Poland and the Baltic states. Remember, Lithuania is on the border with Belarus, and there are Russian troops now in Belarus, and the country is being used as a launch pad for the invasion, specifically to Kiev. So Kiev is being invaded with troops from Belarus.
And Finland.
Hey, what about Finland? What about Finland? I mean, for the first time in Finnish history, there was a poll, more than 50% of the people wanted Finland to join NATO. I mean, you know, this is exactly, Putin could end up with, because he didn't want Ukraine to join NATO, although I thought that was sort of a canard anyway, because he knew that they were going to join NATO. But you know, he doesn't want that, and ends up with Finland, which also shares a substantial border with Russia, joining NATO. But
And
Uh,
sending ordnance to Ukraine. I mean, the Finns are actually
yeah,
sending weapons to Ukraine, which is a rather bold thing to do when you're living in the shadow of, you're within closer to St. Petersburg than, we are to LAX. So the question, I just want our audience to know, I did not intentionally ask about domestic United States politics. I did not ask about people referring to, Putin as a genius, Putin being elegant, but, I didn't want to talk about that. We can, I really wanted to harvest the wisdom of two experts who really know this up close and personal. And what we will be talking about for years to come is the new geopolitical order that's a consequence of this, both vis-a-vis Europe, because I believe Europe is back, but also how it affects, Asia, because the United States was desperately trying to ignore everything and to focus on China. And we've learned, as Anya was writing these books in, in some solitude, has been, showing us for years and years and years. So I just want to give both of you the last word. Anya, why don't you go first, and then we'll give John the final word. Final thoughts.
Final thoughts. I think this is a sad time, honestly, for people who have experienced this. And again, in 91, Soviet tanks, invaded Lithuania. They were, trying to crush the independence movement. So I think anyone in Central and Eastern Europe or in Western Europe who has experienced this does bring back very dark memories. I'm sad for the civilian losses in Ukraine. Because they're really, hostage to this, Putin's, I think, miscalculations, irrational ambitions, and uncertain, really, goals by this point. So I hope next time we speak, we will be, there'll be a more positive development, hopefully.
John?
well, I would certainly agree with that. It's a tragedy that did not have to happen. You talk about a war of choice. This is for sure a war of choice and an unnecessary war. And I think that particularly with the Human Rights Watch report that cluster munitions are being used on civilian populations, I mean, that this could well turn into a humanitarian disaster. And I think, probably the most likely scenario is we end up with a very ugly peace at some point. And I worry about Moldova if Russia comes into Ukraine and what they may end up doing there. And this could well be more than just the Donbass. And I don't see how Putin backs down at this point, I guess is what I'm saying. So I would expect things to get a lot worse before there's any hope of them getting better. So on that optimistic note.
Well, and I keep harking back to what happened in Syria and the predations of the Russians in Syria, aided and abetted, obviously, by Assad. This is, I fear, going to get much worse and much uglier. But again, let me thank you both. I'm always talking about global LA, global California. We care about citizenship. We care about human rights. This is as real for us in Los Angeles as it is for any place else in the world. So I really want to thank you both for, you're both traveling, you're both doing other things, taking time to speak to us here. We really appreciate it. And sadly, I fear, as much as I love to see you both, we will be getting together and talking about this in the further. I want to thank all of our members for joining us. I hope to see you Friday at noon at the Mayborn Hotel for our event with the CEO of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Not a bad business to be in. And I want to thank Valerie, my crime partner here, who made all of this happen. So let me wish everybody a good evening to you, John, and a good day to you, Anya, and to everybody else. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.